Okay, so we are finishing up our Christian Women of the Early Church notes. The first set of notes, we talked about Tabitha, also known as Dorcas, talked about Lydia, and we talked about Phoebe. And then in this second set of notes, we've already talked about Sapphira and Priscilla. We ended the last time we had our character study class discussing Priscilla, how that some have made the example of Priscilla out to represent the idea that it's perfectly fine for women to hold the office of an elder or the office of a deacon, as well as evangelist and things like that. And we noted that that's reading an awful lot of assumption and putting into the context that which doesn't exist regarding Priscilla. However, certainly she is an example worthy of emulation. She, obviously, her and her husband both had a great deal of faith. They established churches in their home, both in Ephesus as well as in Rome. They helped teach Apollos more accurately the things of the Lord. So certainly, and they both, at some point, apparently Paul says they risked their own necks for my sake. So at some point, it would seem that they risked their actual lives to help Paul at some point. So now we come to Eunice and Lois, or Lois and Eunice. Lois is the grandmother of Timothy. Eunice is the mother. And this is during during Paul's, we'll call it his missionary journeys. He comes to what we call Asia Minor, here at Lystra and Derbe. Specifically, Lystra and Derbe is where in Acts chapter 16 and in verse 1, we find that Paul and Silas, this is the second trip of Paul, he's come to Derbe and Lystra, and behold, a certain disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a certain Jewish woman who believed, but his father was Greek. He was well spoken of by the brethren who were at Lystra and Iconium, and Paul wanted to have him go on with him. And he took him and circumcised him because of the Jews who were in that region, for they all knew that his father was Greek. There's a couple of things that we learn from this particular account. And a lot of times Lystra, Derbe, and Iconium are kind of mentioned all at the same time, and it's because they're kind of in that little real close triangle of area. It's all almost interwoven among the brethren in these regions, or in these cities of Lystra, Iconium, and Derbe. And so they all kind of knew each other. They were all familiar with each other. But there is, as I said, there's a couple of facts that we gain from Acts chapter 16. The first one is, it's often suggested that Paul baptized Timothy. Okay? What do we find in Acts chapter 16, verse 1? He was already a disciple. Okay? He says he found, or behold, a certain disciple was there. It would seem as though even though Paul did refer to Timothy as my son in the faith, that doesn't necessarily mean, as has often been implied, that meant that Paul baptized Timothy specifically. I'm sure Paul probably baptized many people, although certainly in Corinth, he says there were only the household of Stephanus and one other person he baptized in Corinth. But the idea is he didn't call, it wasn't like everyone he baptized he called his son or his daughter in the faith necessarily. Instead, what would Paul's reference to Timothy being his son in the faith be suggesting? Sorry? Okay, yeah, and the idea of that relationship that existed. He taught him, he kind of brought him up as an evangelist, kind of taught him how to teach the gospel. Even though it would seem as though Timothy is already a disciple, he's well known, he was well spoken of by the brethren there in verse 2. So it would seem as though the reference to his son in the faith is more so about the relationship that existed. This mentor-mentee, father-son type of relationship that he had with Timothy. And I'm sure Timothy might not have been the only one. Titus also presumed to have been a young evangelist, and Paul wrote to Titus in some of the same ways in which he wrote to Timothy. Timothy's the more well-known reference to being a son in the faith, but that seems to be how Paul is using that phrase. Not that he baptized him, therefore he's my son. It doesn't seem that that's what Paul's describing here. Snoop? Sure. Sure. From a biological perspective, yeah, you could look at it that way. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. It would have been something much more important, which is the blood of the Lord. Yeah. I don't have my timeline with me. This would have been, let's see, Acts 15 would have taken place.
How long he might have been, or how long his mother and grandmother, or were they all new converts at the same time? Kind of thing.
Yeah.
That's what I wondered.
Yeah, I don't know, and I don't have my timeline. I didn't look up what year estimated that this was where Paul was in Lystra and Iconium during this trip. But I mean, presumably after Paul's first trip, churches were established through these regions, and so presumably after that, in that first trip, there was only about a year and a half space between the end of his first trip and the beginning of the second. If that, we're talking maybe a year and a half between his visits to Asia Minor, between the first and second visit. So within that time frame, it would seem that his mother had become a Christian. That's the other thing, that he was the son of a certain Jewish woman who believed. Okay, so she was a Jew who had been converted. She'd become a Christian. So his mother was a Christian. Timothy had become a Christian. Presumably his father, and his father was what ethnicity? Greek, okay. But does it say anything about his father having become a Christian? It doesn't say anything about his father. You would think that it probably would have referenced both his father and his mother having become Christians. It just specifically references his mother. And it's extrapolated or inferred from that perhaps Timothy's father, being a Greek, perhaps particularly following the Roman or the Greek gods and the idolatry, that he continued down that path, at least as of this point. But Timothy obeyed as the gospel as he had been taught regarding Old Testament prophecy and Old Testament scripture and so forth, as we're going to note here in just a minute. Ben? Yeah.
That would tell you that he probably wasn't a Christian.
It can. Yeah, it can. Sometimes that term is used as a contrast. That conjunction, sometimes it's translated and, sometimes it's translated but. The way, obviously, we read it in the English that "but his father was Greek" does give the sense, whether or not that is Paul's intent or Luke's intention necessarily, I don't know, but certainly does give the sense that there's a contrast here between mom and dad. It does seem to be that's the situation. Yeah. Anything else through Acts 16 so far? Okay, so we know that Timothy's already a disciple. Okay, we know his mother is a Christian who was a Jew. We know his father was Greek, who presumably had not yet obeyed. We'll put it that way. Presumably not yet obeyed. Doesn't rule out that maybe he didn't believe in the future. And then in 2 Timothy chapter 1, 2 Timothy chapter 1, and in verse 5, Paul says, starting in verse 3, this is the second letter to Timothy, presumably the last letter to Timothy. Paul is convinced as of chapter 4 here in 2 Timothy that he is about to die. There's some debate as to how long after the writing of 2 Timothy Paul ultimately was put to death, whether it was a couple of months. Some estimates even have up to maybe 2 years. But what we find here is that Paul thinks he's about to die. And so he's writing this, verse 3, "I thank God whom I serve with a pure conscience, as my forefathers did, as without ceasing I remember you in my prayers night and day, greatly desiring to see you, being mindful of your tears, that I may be filled with joy when I call to remembrance the genuine faith that is in you, which dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and in your mother Eunice, and I am persuaded is in you also. Therefore, I remind you to stir up the gift of God which is in you through the laying on of my hands. So, as Paul is writing to Timothy, he's mindful of the tears of Timothy. Certainly, you would think that those tears of Timothy, there's kind of two ways in which this is applied. The tears of Timothy being shed because Paul's in prison, which is kind of the common connection being made. But Paul also says, verse 4, he greatly desires to see him, being mindful of your tears. That suggests that relationship that exists, that those tears are because of that relationship. But there are those who think Paul may be also referencing Timothy's own persecution, because Paul also mentions Timothy's own persecution, that could be also attached to the tears here. I tend to think that it's about the relationship with Paul and Paul being in prison, that's specifically the tears that Paul's referencing. But regardless, he says that he calls to remembrance. He's filled with joy when he remembers kind of the source, the origin of Timothy's faith, that seed that was planted by, ultimately, his grandmother and his mother. Now, no mention in Acts 16 of his grandmother. Now, either his grandmother... Either at that point, Luke, it wasn't important specifically maybe to mention the grandmother, but the typical suggestion or inference here is that the grandmother had already passed away, likely before the church was established. So she likely died following the Old Testament, the Old Law under the law of Moses. But regardless, Paul references her faith, which shows that in whatever state she died, whether it was under the old law, the Mosaical law, or whether she had become a Christian maybe shortly before her death, either way, it would seem as though Paul's acknowledging the fact that this woman lived and died in faithful obedience to the Lord, whether it was law of Moses or after the church was established under the law of Christ. Regardless, the fact that he brings up Lois suggests that this woman was a faithful servant of God. And then his mother Eunice, which she is the one, even though Luke doesn't name her in Acts 16, she's the one that's referenced as having been a Jew who had been converted to become a Christian, who was married to a Greek, and is Timothy's mother. And just kind of as an aside, Eunice here, of course, we say Eunice. I always find it interesting to kind of look up how these names were, or how they would have said them in the times of the New Testament. You know, like Candace, the queen, I mentioned that before, but I mixed up Eunice with Candace. Candace, or Kandake. Here in 2 Timothy chapter 1, Eunice is Eunike. That's how her name is actually pronounced, Eunike. Nobody would know what that meant. So we say Eunice because that's how we read this. And then Paul says, and I am persuaded is in you also. It's kind of an interesting statement from Paul. Why would he say, I'm persuaded it's in you also, if Paul had personally seen the faith of Timothy through the rest of that trip in 2 Timothy, or in Acts 16, and then going through a lot of the other efforts to teach the gospel that Timothy accompanied Paul on? Why would he say this, I'm persuaded is in you also? What type of faith is Paul specifically addressing? Genuine faith. This term genuine, it means pure, not fake, not misplaced or mismotivated or anything like that. This is a pure and undefiled faith. A faith that leads one to ultimately be willing to suffer and die for that faith in service and obedience to God. And it would seem that that's what Paul's specifically referring to. Not just that that Timothy has faith. Obviously, Paul knows that Timothy has faith. But it's this genuine, unfeigned, I think the King James uses unfeigned faith, this genuine, pure faith that is motivated simply by the desire to serve God. And that's it. And even if that means my death or suffering, I'm willing to do that, because I want to serve God. This isn't a faith that is seeking my own gain or seeking to use it for some other purpose, some other ulterior motive, or selfish reasons. I seek to serve God, and that's it. Therefore, I'll do and go through whatever I need to go through. And in fact, the rest of 2 Timothy chapter 1 speaks to that point, that Paul's encouraging Timothy to endure persecution, to go through hardship. And Paul uses himself as an example. That verse 12, I've committed unto him until that day, verse 12, I know who I am. I have believed and am persuaded he's able to keep what I've committed unto him until that day. And this is all within that context of Paul's persecution, and he knows that the same faith that was in his grandmother and his mother is in him as well, is in Timothy as well, that will also lead him to remain faithful no matter what happens. And so that speaks volumes. That it's interesting here because Paul doesn't bring up himself in this situation. Even though Paul sees himself maybe as the Christian father or the faithful father of the Lord that Timothy maybe didn't have growing up in his Greek father, Paul kind of maybe filled that faithful to the Lord type of father figure role. But Paul doesn't incorporate his own example here. He refers to his grandmother and his mother. And when you put this together with 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 15, Paul refers to even in his youth, starting in verse 14, you must continue in the things which you have learned and been assured of, knowing from whom you have learned them, that from childhood you have known the Holy Scriptures, which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith which is in Christ Jesus. Now, you put these two together, who do you think the whom is, or from whom, verse 14, he's referring to? It would seem to be Eunice and Lois, or Lois and Eunice. Okay, a lot of times we look at this and that, well, Paul was the one that taught him this. Well, yeah, Paul did teach him a lot of this stuff and how to persevere, endure persecution, teach the gospel, and so forth. Yes, that's true. He did serve that role for Timothy. But it would seem that Paul is more specifically addressing, back in chapter 1, that genuine faith that Timothy had that had kind of been planted in him by his mother and his grandmother from the Old Testament, from the Old Law, from the prophecies that spoke to the Messiah about the coming of the kingdom of the Lord and so forth. That all of that background is what Paul is referring to. You know from whom you've learned these things. What's the implication that Paul's making? The fact that you know from whom you've learned them. What difference does that make? They're a reliable source. And what did they do?
Well, I'm guessing they not only taught, but also led by example. Because you don't get the kind of faith that Timothy had by someone just saying you have faith.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think they led by example. I think they lived what they taught. And that speaks volumes, especially to children. Children know when we're being hypocrites or when we're saying one thing and doing something else. And it suggests that what we say we believe may not really be what we believe or may not be as important as we make it out to be. And so kids pick up on that. And yet Eunice and Lois, or Lois and Eunice, they implanted not only this genuine faith coming from the Old Testament scriptures, the prophecies and so forth, the character of Jehovah, the coming of the kingdom of the Lord and so forth, but they practiced it themselves. They persevered in service to the Lord under the Mosaic law first, and then of course eventually his mother was baptized, Timothy was baptized, whichever one came first. But regardless, Paul's referring to their example, their character. You know from whom you've learned these things, and that from childhood. Paul wasn't there at Timothy's childhood. Eunice and Lois were. You have known the Holy Scriptures, which are able to make you wise for salvation. Not only do you know the Scriptures, you know the type of effect it has on people when they commit themselves to it. That's what the Old Testament Scriptures were able to do for the Jew who was willing to be a Jew of the heart, Not a Jew outwardly, as Paul would refer to with the Romans. A true Jew is not a Jew who is one outwardly and of the circumcision, but one who is circumcised of the heart. One who is a Jew inwardly, who seeks to serve God in faith. Is that screen blinking on and off for you guys? I'm sorry. Okay, I'll try to fix that in between service here. Ben?
That's kind of getting lost in our day and age with cell phones, Google, and all this information at our fingertips. That you don't have to rely on your family or anybody for information. You just get on your phone. Who is the president, such and such, and you find out, right?
Yeah.
And so, how do you influence people in that manner today? It's how you live,
Yeah.
how you act.
You know,
So that trust is built on your actions, nothing else.
you know, one of the, a lot of times, especially, and it's not that this has changed any, but it is perhaps more so, even more so emphasized in our society today, which is a lot of times some ask the question, what's the best way? What's the wisest way, or the perhaps the most thorough way of trying to reach out to somebody, to teach somebody? For years, for 50 years ago, 60 years ago, you could go around, knock on doors, and people would actually answer and talk to you. And a lot of people would actually say, yeah, I'll sit down to study the Bible with you. Or at the very least, they would politely say, no thanks. Today, they won't even open the door. If it's not on their phone or on their computer, they don't really care. But in the end, it's the relationships that we form by which people see that we live what we believe. But that's different from how other people act, even religious people, how they live. It's amazing some of these times, especially with celebrities, but not just celebrities and sports icons and so forth, but people who claim to be religious, and yet the way they speak, the way the relationships they're in, their activities and so forth, they proclaim the Lord. They say that they follow God, they follow Jesus, and yet their life does not bear in any way any type of sign of that type of a life. And it kind of goes to show, not to say that they are Christian or a servant of God in name only. I'm sure they think they are. But it goes back, and we've said it before, and we need to continue to say it. In John 14, Jesus says, if you love me, what will you do? Keep my commandments. Okay, it's not rocket science. It's not very difficult. But a lot of people aren't willing to do that. Lois and Eunice were. They were willing to put into practice what it was that the Old Testament taught regarding the law of Moses, and to put into practice in the law of Christ, at least for Eunice, and Timothy followed suit. All right, so he refers to the genuine faith that was in Lois and Eunice. It's unclear if Lois survived the teaching of the gospel, but Lois, we know, had been converted, but Eunice had been converted. Acts 16, verse 1 on your notes, I'm sorry. Paul seems to allude to their success in teaching Timothy the law and the prophets here in 2 Timothy chapter 3 and in verse 15. So, what lesson or lessons can we learn from Lois and Eunice? Go ahead, Doug.
Just passing it on to the next generation.
Okay, the legacy of a faithful life.
Daughter, son.
Yeah. And that's difficult even in the best of times. But right now, especially with all of the influences that are facing our children, and whether our children are 5 years old or 15, 20 years old, it doesn't make any difference. They're all our children, right? So long they're our children, no matter how old they get. But the fact of the matter is, with all of the influences that they face in our society, and like Ben mentioned, access to information, some of which may be good, some of which not good. With all of that, it puts even more responsibility, even more pressure on us as parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, individuals who are seeking to be an impact on somebody's life. Doug, if you'll just unplug. Seeking to be an impact on other people in their lives, it's difficult to do that. And it just kind of puts all the more importance on the need for us to do it. and to be consistent. That's my word, consistent in it. And it's difficult. What other lessons can we learn from Lois and Eunice? What were you going to say, Snoop?
Kind of what you said, moms have a huge influence on their children. They're, especially the first 5 years of what's so important. And I've been thinking about the fact that his father was Greek, and that his mom must have lived different than other people, because it never says there was any conflict. And Timothy turned out pretty cool, so his dad had to be somewhat of a good man, I think. You know, his mother-in-law was an influence on his son, his wife was an influence, I'm sure he was too, but, you know, just that relationship
Yeah.
of, let's just say, for lack of my knowledge, a believer and an unbeliever
Yeah.
together, and yet the son, by the influence of the grandmother and the mother, ended up being a believer.
Well, I mean, and that actually brings us to that second part of this last question. What additional detail makes Timothy's upbringing and training even more impressive? And it's the fact that the father wasn't a Christian during his upbringing, or wasn't a servant of God under the old law even during his upbringing. And that is particularly difficult. And in any age, to have a parent who isn't a faithful servant of God, that puts all the more pressure on the believing parent to try to do the best we can, to try to impact our children, to try to direct them in the way they need to go, to teach them the way they should. That the fact that Timothy didn't go after idolatry, perhaps the way his father had, it also kind of gave Timothy a unique perspective, perhaps, of being able to know the details of both sides of this equation when they're going to these different cities. You know, Paul, certainly he had the Jewish background, being trained at the feet of Gamaliel, but so did Timothy. Timothy had been taught the Jewish part of it by his grandmother and mother, but I'm sure he had been exposed to the idolatry part of it by his father in some form or fashion, if not specifically his father, his society certainly. He would have been exposed to that as well. And so kind of coming from a say, divided home, but a kind of a mixed home like that, kind of put Timothy in an interesting situation and perspective to be able to understand how to approach maybe individuals who had been raised following the idols of the Romans and the Gentile or the Greeks. Kind of maybe gave him a little bit of insight into that. All right, first of all, I thought I saw a hand over here somewhere. Did I? Anywhere? No? Okay. Yes, Snoop?
I was gonna say, when you add the layer of the fact that women kind of had no rights back then, he was the son, I don't know if he was the firstborn, and that's but he was the son, and back then, boys had way more, but yet we have this boy living in a Jewish Greek home
Yeah.
that follows in the steps of his Jewish mother and grandmother. So there had to be some difference in what he saw in his parents that caused him to,
Yeah.
the faith, the constant.
Well, and it was unfeigned faith. It wasn't a divided faith. And that's what Paul's pointing out here, is that what you have in you, it's not divided. It's not part loyalty to my dad and part loyalty to, my dad's gods and my mom's God. That's not what it was. He was completely devoted to the Lord for his own sake, not just because mom and grandma taught me that. But you're absolutely right, Snoop. Pam? That's true. That's exactly right. Yes. Absolutely. And that's a great point to remember. A lot of times when we gather together obviously for the purpose of worshiping God, and that's number one. Secondly, to encourage and edify one another, to study God's Word, and so forth. And when we're here, we we focus on trying to be uplifting and encouraging. At least that should be our goal. But we need to always remember that no matter how bad a day we've had during the day on Wednesday or maybe on Friday at work, coming in Sunday for worship, whatever it is, that little eyes are watching even us who may not be in their homes. They're watching the adults. They're watching us. And I mean, I know when I was growing up, eventually when I wanted to, become a Christian and so forth, I would watch what the guys would do, how they would serve the Lord's Supper, how they would lead prayer, how they would lead singing and all of that. And I sought to emulate them, but I looked to the older fellas, the older guys, kind of for my cue on how to act in worship or how to act among the brethren after worship or before worship. They were kind of the ones that I looked to, and I'm sure the young ladies did the same thing with the older women. And that's, in fact, Paul tells Timothy that that's how it's supposed to be. Okay, this is the way it's supposed to work. This is how you're supposed to behave yourself or how to conduct yourself in the house of God. Making an understanding or recognizing the difference and of the different age groups, the different genders and so forth, and acknowledging that and treasuring that. Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, being that example, being that role model, sometimes whether we realize it or not, we're role models for people that are younger than us. And for our younger individuals, younger guys and girls, the little kids, they look up to us. Okay, when we're 15, 16, 17 years old, the little kids, they're looking up to us. And our example goes a long way for them as well, whether we realize it or not. Yeah. All right. Anything else through Timothy or through Lois and Eunice?
They didn't know they were doing it, but by their early efforts those years, think of the co-worker they gave Paul.
Oh man.
And so many other congregations.
Yeah. Well, and that that's a great point as well, is you never know just how large the seed you plant in somebody's heart, the faith that you try to nourish in somebody, you never know how big that will grow and how many other plants it's going to affect. But I mean, Timothy was an integral part of the work that Paul did. Just for Paul's sake, the encouragement that Timothy gave him, the help that he was for him. And then not to mention all of the brethren that Timothy affected as well. And Lois and Eunice, I'm sure they never knew that that's what was going to happen. All they knew was this little boy is our responsibility to teach and train in the way of the Lord. And that's what they did. And then, of course, who gives the increase? The Lord does. And he certainly did with Timothy. All right. Okay, that's where we'll stop. We're done with our notes on the Christian women of the early church. The notes for Cain and Abel are on the back table. The second bell will ring here in a minute or two, but I don't think we ought to start. We're just barely going to get into it before the bell's going to ring. So the Cain and Abel notes, as I said, they're also in your emails. They're also on the table, so pick those up if you are so inclined. And we will start Cain and Abel next Wednesday. Doug? Yeah.
And that we ought to be doing the same thing.
Yeah. I mean, we are blessed to have quite a large group of young kids at this congregation. And that's not very commonplace for a lot of churches. And to have that group and knowing that they, a lot of times we say they're the future of the church. In a lot of ways, as they're getting to that age of accountability, they're getting to an age to start talking about and thinking about being baptized and maybe do become baptized. They're not just the future of the church, they're now part of the church. And knowing that and nourishing that and helping that to know that there will always be the church that belongs to the Lord. Long after we're gone, as long as the Lord continues to allow this world to exist, the church will always be here. And we want to make sure our young ones are a part of that. All right. Thank you, everybody.